Hello, 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 and welcome to Coffee with the Carter Man. And today we have a very special show for you. You know the rules. Everybody knows the rules. We always open with a review of the news and a interview. Then we finish up with our predictions. Today we're going to dispense with the rules because I have an interview for you, which, well, I'm just going to say it, is going to be life changing. I'm going to guarantee it. It's going to be life changing because of the extraordinary life that our guest has led. What he has to say can change your life professionally, personally, and politically. In fact, how do I know that? Let me read you a short excerpt. Short before we bring him on. I don't want to read it while he's on because he's a very modest gentleman. I don't want to embarrass him. But in his autobiography, in John McNabb's autobiography, A Nice Ride, which you should get, let me read you, if I may, just one short paragraph from the preface by Harold Hamm, the great oil magnate, who's a good friend of John's. John McNabb, quote, John McNabb has been a leader at every stage of his life, captain of his high school football team, rising to the rank of captain in the U.S. Air Force, and becoming a true captain of industry as a businessman. No matter what endeavor he's undertaken, John McNabb has reached the pinnacle. That's a heck of a thing to be able to say. And Harold Hamm added, he's done it by pulling himself up from the bootstraps in West Virginia's coal country. That's why I say he changed his life. He can change yours. So let's talk to John Thomas McNabb. John, welcome. Welcome to Coffee with the Carter Man.
Thanks, Carter. Happy to be here.
I didn't want to read that with you on because you're a dear friend. I know how modest you are, but that's a hell of an introduction to your book. I mean, unbelievable, and it's exactly accurate. And what I'd like to do, I would like to go back and start. I promised everybody that what you say can change their life personally, professionally, and politically. So let's go back, if you don't mind, to where Harold Hamm says you pulled yourself up from your bootstraps in West Virginia's coal country, Kanawha County. Is that right?
Kanawha.
Kanawha. You can see I read it without listening to it. That it is, and that is really southern West Virginia coal country. Matter of fact, I think 18 of your forebears, your relatives, died in the what was it, the Clark County coal mines, they're in the area where you were born, right?
That's correct. 18 of them passed away in coal mine accidents, Carter.
Unbelievable,
Yeah.
unbelievable. So you were raised in that, but I want to make a quick point, okay? I want to make a quick point that you were raised in really a tough, rough environment, okay? But you were raised by a good and decent, and as you say, patriotic, loving family. As a matter of fact, at Duke University, I love that. I'm sorry to read this, but I've got to read this. And I know at Duke University, the English professor told you to write your life story, and you started the paper out with the sentence that I wasn't much to look at, but I was something to love because of that loving family you came from. Take us back, John. How does a guy come from the tough, rough, cold country to become the leader that you've become in every area, as Harold Hamm pointed out?
Yeah, Carter, it's and thanks for that. It's as I think about my family and I think about them at 80 years old, they're most all gone now. But I think about them daily. My grandfather on my dad's side and grandmother didn't go to school. He was a painter. In fact, he painted the part of the dome of the West Virginia Capitol many, many, many decades ago.
Right.
On my mother's side, my grandfather was an entrepreneur. He had a third grade education. He served in World War I when he was 14 years old. He just volunteered. And my grandmother had the most education on my mother's side. My grandmother had the most education of my four grandparents. She went to the fourth grade. So those four grandparents had 7 years of schooling.
Total.
But they were, and the men lived on both sides of my family. The men lived pretty hard. They weren't, it wasn't like drinking or any of that stuff. It was just they worked hard. And they lived to an average age of 67. I'm now 80. And the women, of course, lived longer. They were tougher. And they lived to 84 as an average. And I can remember growing up and going to a family reunion where every one of the women wore black. And it used to scare the kids to death.
Right,
and
right.
We would all eat in this pavilion. And then the women would go and preach by themselves. And the men would go to a different pavilion, open air with a roof, and preach as well. And the kids would play, get tired. And then the women and men would come back together again and drive everybody home. And that was our reunions. And I thought growing up, but anyway, it was a wonderful upbringing. And as I thought about growing up, and I think people should always do this. I think all people should try to find out their roots.
Right, right.
And, in my case, I'm related to one of the kings of the Picts, the painted people in Scotland who the Romans really didn't like a lot because the Picts were on them as the Romans tried to go into Scotland across the Apennine and all that. So anyway, I've looked back, and on the hillside during the Revolutionary War, Stuart Hill actually served with George Washington and spent that real bad winter at Valley Forge.
Right.
On the other hand, the McNabbs were fighting in Massachusetts with the Black Watch and the English, the Scottish English.
So the hillside was your mother's side. The hillside,
My mother's side.
Right.
And on that side, I can trace back to Daniel Boone, who's a direct of mine. I can trace back to Edwin Morris, he and Boone were the first people to settle the Kanawha Valley. And the river runs through the valley. The Kanawha River runs west into the Ohio, which then runs into the Mississippi down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that was all Indian infested back in the day. And my background, by the way, I'm part Cherokee through Ross. And the Cherokees got along pretty well with the white settlers. The Shawnees did not. And another one of my relatives, a man named Van Bibber. And Van Bibber was bigger than life. And he was hunting one day near the Kanawha Falls. And the Shawnee didn't like that a lot. So the wife heard across the river, heard a lot of commotion. And they had a brown bear who was a puppy, a pet. And it was a big brown bear. And so she jumped in the canoe, rowed across with the brown bear to rescue Van Bibber, who leapt off of like a 30-foot rock. There's a yard sign up there on the river, the road on Highway 60 about Van Bibber's leap. And he jumps in the canoe, and Brownie is in the back of the canoe. And the Shawnees, the only reason that Van Bibbers lived during that is that the bear was so big, he took all the arrows and killed him. I mean, but anyway, on the McNabb side, I go through Canada, Scotland to Canada. So
right. John, before we get back to the McNabbs, I want to point something out. You mentioned John Ross, the chief, right? Yeah. Indian chief John. He was one of the Cherokee chieftains who led the Trail of Tears, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, he did. His dad was Scottish, and that was my background as well.
Right.
So Ed was Scottish, and David Ross, the dad, took a Cherokee woman as his wife,
Right.
and a son named John Ross. And John Ross was a local chieftain in the Appalachian area where I grew up. And he fought with Andrew Jackson
Right.
at the Battle of New Orleans, and then came back and negotiated with Congress, with the U.S. Congress. John Ross could speak Cherokee, different Indian dialects, and also English. So he was a pretty educated guy, verbally, local.
Right.
And he went to Washington and negotiated because he could speak English and Cherokee. He negotiated the Trail of Tears. He led the Trail of Tears to eastern Oklahoma.
Wow.
The Cherokee all got together and voted him as the president of the Chieftains Council. So he was the chieftain of the whole Cherokee tribe.
Wow.
So that's the end of that. On the
Great
hillside, besides Stuart Hill, who fought with Washington during the Revolutionary War,
right.
There were other famous generals who came from the hillside, and one of them was Ambrose Powell Hill, A.P.
Right.
Hill, and he was a West Point graduate. But during the Civil War, and I don't know that people really understand, the Civil War wasn't about slavery; it was about states' rights, and that had something to do with the agrarian, nature of the industry in the South. But A.P. Hill was a big Virginian, and Virginia sort of took precedence over the U.S. back then, just as Massachusetts did, as well up in North New England. So A.P. Hill, although was a U.S. general, decided to side with the Confederacy, and he became Stonewall Jackson's #1 general.
Right.
And he and Jackson actually didn't like each other, but Jackson had to deal with him, with A.P. Hill, because A.P. Hill was such a fierce warrior. Hill went into battle. He would take off his jacket and went into battle with a red undershirt on, long sleeve undershirt, and led the battle. Didn't finish the war. After Appomattox, he was going back to Virginia, to Richmond, and was shot by some snipers.
Wow.
And Hill didn't finish. So anyway, it's a little bit of the background on the McNabb side. Alexander McNabb was a Canadian who fought with the British, lost his life at Waterloo, and he was an aide de camp for General Picton, a British General Picton. Alexander McNabb before was Governor General of Gibraltar. And you go into St. Paul Cathedral now and you'll see a memorial plaque to Alexander McNabb. Another McNabb was Governor General of Canada. As a matter of Napier, Alan Napier McNabb. So it's an interesting background on both sides. And so what I would recommend people do is understand their background, their history. And it really opened my eyes. And now I wondered, why I had that spark to go do things.
Right. Right.
To do even today at 80 years old. And it comes back to, where my roots were.
Your entire roots. How much of this did your mother and your father talk to you about? I mean, how far back did they recall?
My mother turned into a genealogist. And so I learned a lot from her. She ended up at the Craig Patton House, and this is near Charleston on the Kanawha River. And this is General Patton's grandfather's house, George Patton's grandfather. And this Patton was a lieutenant colonel in the Confederacy. And my mom got involved with the colonial dames. My mother, is in that group.
Right.
Due to her relationship with Edwin Morris, who came to was one of the first settlers with Daniel Boone in the Kanawha Valley. By the way, Edwin Morris who's a direct relative, and Daniel Boone, a direct relative, were the first two members from Western Virginia before the Civil War, when Virginia was still consolidated. They were the first two members of the Virginia legislature, those two. So, the more I dig into this, and then during the wars, McNabb's War and the Hills, by the way, were fierce fighters. I think that's another thing that probably is rubbed off a little bit. So but I would recommend people doing that, trying to understand their backgrounds, because it gives you a sense for who you are.
And do you think when you were, whenever I think about, when I read your book for the first time, and folks, this is a great read. It's a read that is instructive on how you want to live, as well as a fascinating history on John's life, how he lived. When you were a youngster, and as I read the book, at some points I almost felt like I was watching the Waltons. Okay,
Oh,
because of the values instilled in you, some of which we can tell by the background that all your parents ever knew from generations back was hard work and patriotism and godliness. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. Those were the three keys. And they were tough people. My grandfather had one of my grandfathers that went to school had a third grade education, and he built a very nice meat business. And they still sell in West Virginia the Buzz buttered steak that my grandfather kind of put together and marketed. We were in the meat business. And I worked there from the time I was 10 years old every summer. I punched the clock when I was 10 years old. You put the little clock in and then you hand and he overpaid me. He paid me $1.25 when I was 10 years old. There weren't any work laws back then, and I don't think it would have made any difference anyway. And then later, when I started driving a truck, as I got older, I would go to work at 2 a.m. with my father, and we'd load trucks and then go deliver them. So I'd get up at 2 in the morning, load the trucks, go back to sleep on some cardboard boxes I'd flattened out outside the cooler and the freezer. And I would sleep for 3 or 4 hours till 7 when I got up and went to work. And that's what I did in the summers. I played baseball, trained for football, and worked in a meat plant.
In a meat plant. And was it your father or your grandfather who told you don't get near the edge of the elevator?
Oh yeah, it was. We didn't have OSHA back then, thank goodness. And one day, I mean, he was a bright guy without much education, but one day he was thinking about something else as he went up in the elevator, and it cut all the toes off on one of his feet. In fact, it literally severed his shoe. And I didn't know that can you imagine the pain?
Oh man. Oh.
And he was 6'3". He was smart as heck. I'll tell you what he did. He read. He was a voracious reader. And that's how he educated himself. And so, one of my thoughts has been read, learn, and lead.
Read, learn, and lead. I like that.
And so that's
kind of that down, folks.
Life.
Write that down. I mean, that's it. That's great advice. And so as a kid, you're working almost around the clock.
Yeah.
And yet you have time. And when you say you play baseball, now I am, my life ambition, and you don't know this because you and I never talked, my life ambition was to play baseball. That was it. And everything else I ever did in my life was secondary. And I feel like I failed in life because that was it. Play baseball, right? But when you were a kid, you worked virtually around the clock. But not only did you play, but they selected you as the captain of the high school team. All right, let's start right there with the leadership that Harold Hamm talks about. Why? Why did they select you as the leader? That's what we want to know. Now, you went on to become one of the most successful businessmen in America, advisor to the President of the United States, and a leader. Why? Why why did your friends look at you at that age and say, you be the leader of the team, John?
Well, I thought a lot about that, actually. Part of it was self-esteem. Excuse me, Carter. For some reason, and it wasn't love, wasn't care, wasn't being taken care of as a young person, but I just didn't have a good self-esteem. I have no idea why. And growing up isn't easy for anybody. I don't care if there's a silver spoon or no spoon. It's just not easy. And for some reason, I chose athletics and then became a leader to sort of negate the self-esteem problem that I had. I don't have that anymore, of course. At 80, it's a little late to worry about that. But just a
John,
spark that I wanted to go do things and make a difference.
Yeah.
And that's really what I've done. I remember I went down to the annex. We had a AAA baseball park in Charleston at the time. It was a beautiful park and could seat about 5,000 people. And so the AAA was just under the major leagues back then, the American Association. And right next to it was a little annex where there were ball fields. And I went down one day. I was always playing something. And I went down to the park and I saw this team practicing. And, I didn't know hoot from holler. So I went over there and the coach said, looked at me and said, "Hey, you want to try out?" I said, "Well, try out for what?" He said, "No, it's a church baseball team. It's a Baptist church." And he said, "Here, go take this bat and see what you can do with it." Well, I hit the ball out of the park in my first pitch. I know it's crazy, and he said, "Son, here's your hat." And it said KCBC, Can All See Baptist Church. It had a big cross on it and a blue hat. So I go down, I go home. I was always walking. I didn't ride a bike or anything. And so I walked miles to play sports and stuff, literally miles. And I walked home, which is like a half mile. It wasn't anything. And I had this hat on. And Mom said, "Well, what's that?" I said, "Well, I just joined a baseball team, but the issue is we have to go to this church." And then Dad comes in the room, and we all huddle up, but we decided to become Baptists. Anyway, and then later on, during my senior year and at Duke, when I come home for Christmas, I preached at that church. My senior year, the minister had a heart attack. And I can remember preaching Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, Monday night, and Thursday night. The Baptists were always in church.
Yeah.
And I preached for 3 or 4 months. And then involved with Christianity after that and was president of the FCA chapter at Duke University. I actually spoke at the national conference one year. It was Fran Tarkenton, Steve Sloan from Alabama, and me. The three of us were the speakers. And this was in Black Mountain where Billy Graham lived. And I'll be darned, Billy Graham didn't come backstage and talk to the three of us.
Wow.
And of course, there were no phones back then. I know, I didn't have a camera or anything, but it would have been really cool to have a picture with Billy Graham. But I have it in my mind.
Oh, yeah. No, let me back up on when you preached for the minister who had the heart attack in a Baptist church. I got to ask you this. My father was a Methodist minister, a fundamentalist Methodist minister.
Oh, yeah.
Did you give an invitation? Did you give the altar call?
I couldn't do that. I tell you what I did do. I asked for the offering.
Good. Okay.
So I couldn't do the invitation, of course. But it was good, and I enjoyed that. I went to the FCA camps every summer at Duke. Duke had a very active chapter, a Fellowship of Christian Athletes chapter, and so I went all over the country, in the summers to go to camps and spoke 2 or 3 times. Met some really good guys. The last FCA camp I went to, my roommate was a Georgia guard. And then I played with a couple Georgia guys in an all-star game later that year. It was an interesting life.
Interesting life. Now, at Duke, you were, again, we're getting back to this leadership. At Duke, you were an All-American, right?
Yeah, two All
You were
American, right?
All-American at Duke, and a team leader. Again, they look to you for your leadership, right?
Yeah, it was it, and the team members voted, not the coaches. So the captain of the team, there were three captains that year. The captain was John Gutekunst, a wonderful guy, wonderful friend of mine. Was a head coach in college. Was the assistant coach of the year in the NCAA. Wonderful, good guy. Still a good freight friend. And then there were two alternate captains, and Chuck Drulis, who was a great player, and his dad was a coach for the St. Louis Cardinals, and me were the three captains. Um, and it was a real honor because my teammates voted us into that position.
Your teammates. So you were an All-American. You were the captain of the team. You had a chance to become a professional football player. I mean, there's just no doubt about it.
Right.
And instead, you went in the military and went to Vietnam.
Right. Yeah. Sure did. And I had two combat tours in Vietnam. I flew out of two fighter wings in Thailand. I flew the 355th TAC fighter wing out of Tak Lee, about 50 miles or so north of Bangkok. And then the second tour was the 388th TAC fighter wing out of Korat, which is in the Thai Central Highlands. And those wings just flew north. We flew Laos. We didn't fly in South Vietnam. We flew mainly North Vietnam and Laos. So it was
137
July.
combat missions.
But,
137 combat missions.
correct. Yeah, sure did. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Let me ask you a question, because I know it's on every one of our viewers' minds, and it's a question that occurs. Like people like me, I never had your courage. I didn't go to Vietnam. Okay, I stayed in college, whatever I could do not to go. The exact opposite of what you, with your courage and your leadership, did. But when you're flying 137 combat missions with all the anti-aircraft fire coming up, weren't you scared?
Yeah, I'd like to tell you I was, but I wasn't. I just think I was young enough to that was a job. But every night was the 4th of July. Every night, there was plenty of fireworks. And by the way, Carter, you're selling yourself real short. I mean, I volunteered to fight with the Israelis, okay, like you did. I think I was too old to go over to Israel during the first war, but you did. You tried to volunteer with the Israeli government to go fight the IDF.
Well, you're very kind. They didn't. I should add. I went to Israel during the first Gulf War, but they didn't let me fight with them. They said, this whole guy, he's going to get us killed if we put him out there. So, but I appreciate what you just said. But the question I ask you, really, when we look at people like you who have done what you did over and over again, like I want to make clear to people, when I say, and when Harold Ham said you were a captain of industry, I need to make this clear. Let me just, for the sake of our viewers, I've got to do this, John, even if it embarrasses you some. Vice President of Finance for Lyco Energy in Dallas, worked with multi-billion-dollar investment portfolio for Prudential Capital, founded the Growth Capital Partners in the 90s, served as chairman and CEO of Wilbros Group, one of the largest energy contractors in the world. So you weren't in industry, John. You were at the top of industry. Okay, the top of industry. Mm-hmm. And that takes more than intellect and energy. It takes leadership. Over and over in each of these, they turn to you to lead. Why?
Well, it gets back to, why I was the captain of the football team or the wrestling team or the baseball team or the basketball team or whatever. Somebody else picks that. you don't pick it yourself. And so what I would tell to people, and I'm now in the Horatio Alger Association. Was inducted about a year ago, which is a wonderful honor. It's a wonderful organization. And I remember telling the students, we all, the new inductees, had a chance to talk to the students who were received scholarships, that you want to make a difference. You want to enjoy your life, but help other people. And so that's really what I did. I mean, I didn't pick myself for anything. I didn't pick myself to be a captain at the football team or this or that. President Trump, offered me, contingent upon Rick Perry going to the VA. I was offered through Mark Meadows at dinner one night in Asheville, was offered to become Secretary of Energy, which I accepted. About 2 years later, I was invited up again to have lunch at the Capitol Hill Club, the Republican Club on Capitol Hill. And they discussed a different position with me, cabinet position. That's not public information, so I'll stop there. And I said no. I'd learned enough about Washington that it just wasn't a place that I wanted to spend a lot of time. I'm still on the Holocaust Council, the Board of Visitors. I have one more year. I go off in 2025. And President Trump put me on that, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoy the mission of the Holocaust Council, the memorial in D.C., what the Jewish public is having to deal with in the States. It's amazing. It's incredibly awful, this anti-Semitism. Yeah. And it had roots, very bad roots in Europe. Yeah. I don't like the flow of things again here in the States. I just don't like that.
We're in a horrible situation with the Jewish people right now.
Oh, it's just awful. And I'm still close with the Israelis. Still very close with Netanyahu's chief of staff, Rena Rieger. I'm still was very close to the former head of the Mossad, Danny Yatam. It's been a while since I've been with him, but I've spent a lot of time in Israel over the last 10 years. Love Israelis. I love the whole country is spiritual.
Yes.
And that's why people should go to Israel to understand spirituality. Go to the Jordan River, go to the Galilee, go to Bethlehem. And it's tough over there right now. It's with Hamas. Hamas murdered 40 Americans on October 7th. I don't know if people know that. There's still Americans that are imprisoned by Hamas, but the Hamas terrorists murdered 40 Americans that day on October 7th. You don't hear much about that.
Nothing. John, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do want to get a little bit into your political leadership here. That, and I want to, for a minute, stick with that Hamas, the October 7th, because number one, the very fact that it was one of the most barbaric acts committed by Hamas in the history of the world. Genghis Khan never did what Hamas did to the Jewish people on October 7th.
Now, Alexander the Great was honorable. The Romans tried to be honorable. Now, as far as vicious fighters and soldiers, but they were at least honorable until they ran into the Picts up in northern Scotland, I might add.
Your relatives, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I think, and now we have, and the two elements shock me right now, and I want to get your feelings on this, your opinion on it. One is the fact that on our college campuses, particularly Harvard and the Ivy League schools, University of Pennsylvania, you have students who are protesting on behalf of Hamas and supporting the October 7th massacre. What's your comment?
Absolutely. I went to Duke twice. I'm going to call here a second. Excuse me. I went to Duke twice. and wants to play football, and I got a full scholarship. And then after Vietnam, I came back to Duke at their invitation. I got a job working there and got my MBA. And then over a number of years after that, I've done professional training at Dartmouth,
Yes.
Northwestern, Stanford, Chicago, and well, that may be it. And so I've been on some Ivy League campuses. I used to recruit at a couple of Ivy League schools when I was in the oil and gas business and when I was working at Prudential. So I got a real sense for it. This has been going on for a long time. This isn't new. And so what's happened, I look at where Harvard is, or Columbia, unfortunately, Harvard, unfortunately, or the mainstream media. This has taken a long time to grow. And you could go back to the Washington Post with Mark Graham and go back way back then and see how left and divisive the mainstream media's become. I remember when I was 13, we got a TV set. And it was 12 by 12.
Yeah.
Of course, black and white. And, we had the rabbit ears and the aluminum foil on it.
John, you and I are the same age, so I remember that. How many times did you hear people say, don't move, you're going to mess up the picture?
Yes. But I remember Arthur Merle and others reading the news.
Right.
They read the news.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't really that slanted back then.
No.
Like it is today. And so I really look at the Ivy League schools, and Duke's been really good about that. They've done a much better job of managing that mess that's going on in other places with the student body. I mean, in fact, UNC's probably worse than Duke as far as, as far as all that politicization of campuses, the divisiveness, the anti-Semitism. But anyway, it's a real problem in the country, and that's one reason I've stayed involved with Israel. But people should go to Israel. They should do the 4 or 5 things I just mentioned. Go to the Galilee. It's safer now, thank goodness. With Hezbollah actually Hezbollah is gone, basically.
Yeah.
So the northern part of Israel is safe again.
That's right.
Anyway, please continue.
And so you and I share these opinions so precisely. And even now, okay, as these little, what Carville called snot-nosed little punks, even as they are protesting against Israel on behalf of Hamas, Hamas
crazy.
monsters are still holding, and this to me is stunning, 101 hostages. They are terrorizing and torturing, and our government isn't saying one damn word about it. Comment on that, John.
Well, just for a second, I mean, and I'm political to a degree. I'm out of now, and I'm happy about that, by the way. I'm very happy that President Trump is going to be the 47th president as long as he was at the 45th president. Very happy about that. I think he's learned a lot of lessons from this upcoming presidency on who he's putting in the cabinet, who he's populating around himself. Very strong, solid people. And I think he did a good job the first time too. Not because I was in that mix, but I do think but you've learned, you live and learn. I also think that the non-standard media like this podcast is making a huge difference in the country. A huge difference in the country. And I think that helped President Trump win again just recently. But, we have a real problem in the country. And part of it is, just like we have 40 Americans killed on October 7th. Who knows that?
Nobody.
People don't know it because that's not something that we need to tell people because that's not part of our agenda. And so during the Spanish-American War, there was something called yellow journalism. If you think about that, it was very stilted and one-sided, and we have it again. We basically have yellow journalism in the United States, and so it's a real problem, and that's also infected our campuses. But I went to a lot of different schools, paid for by other people or myself, all those different colleges I attended for professional training. And this is a guy who, nobody went to college. Most of the people didn't finish high school in my family.
Right, right. I think you were the first, right? You were the first in your family ever to go to college.
Right. We had, I had an uncle, my dad's brother, and he was a lieutenant colonel, went to West Virginia, and the parents paid for one college, and he went to West Virginia, and he wrote the chemical warfare study for D-Day. Was living in London, but as far as my direct family, I was the first. My brother went to West Virginia and was an all-star, not athletically but business-wise, and he was the number 2 or 3 guy at Korn Ferry for years. He passed away very young at 65. And he and I were a lot alike. I was on 2 New York Stock Exchange boards. At the same time, he was on a London Stock Exchange board and a New York board. I mean, that's kind of what came out of our family, my mom and dad.
How does someone who was raised in a family that was, I don't want to say they were broke, but they certainly were not very wealthy, how in the hell you get so savvy about finances? I don't get it. I mean, when you were a little kid, did you count every penny and take care of the piggy bank or what? Well, how does that happen?
When I started making $1.25 an hour at 10 years of age, Mom and Dad set me up with a checking account. Now, I didn't ever use it, and then I worked every summer. Even when I was at Duke, I worked part-time in the summer someplace. And so I bought my first car. My first car was purchased by my grandfather and grandmother because I was thumbing and taking, I was spending 10 cents on a local bus to get from the high school and back. Now, I thumbed. It was safe then to hitchhike. But when it was time to buy my first car, I paid for it because I'd saved that much money. And my mother.
What was it? What was it? What was it?
It was just part of this capitalistic trend.
I mean, what was the car? What was the make?
It was a Buick.
Nice.
Yeah, my first car was a Chevy too. Oh no, my first car was an Impala, 5-speed Impala, and it was hot. It was and it was fast. I'd earned the money, and I thought I'd just buy something hot.
What year was it?
Oh my gosh, I'm thinking now. It's 69, about the time. Right after college, 67.
67. So it was right after high school.
Right. Well, no, after college.
After college.
I drove a car that my grandmother and grandfather bought for me all the way through college. And when I bought my first car, it was from just working, at night and working weekends and working in the summers. I bought that right before I got drafted and then volunteered to go in the Air Force. So it sat for a few years.
Unbelievable. So you have spoken, I don't know if you're still doing it, but you used to speak to a lot of colleges. You would go and just talk to them and answer questions like you're doing for us very kindly right now, across the board. Okay.
Yep.
And I remember watching one of them. I've watched several of them, and one of them, you made it clear to them that you understood that they were not going to agree with most of what you had to say. Was that invariably the experience? And how did you handle that?
Pretty much. It depended on the audience. It depended on the college. You see, I'm still on the Duke Fuqua board. It's one of the top rated business schools in the world. It's in the top 10 or 15 or whatever.
Right.
And it's still one of the top 10 schools in the U.S. and I'm a emeritus. In other words, they can't kick me off. I mean, they've made me emeritus, so I think they're just happy if I don't show up, kind of thing, at 80 years old. But I love Duke. It's been great for me. And I was chairman of the board at the University of Houston, which people don't know much about. I mean, Houston, they certainly do, but not my involvement there. But I taught regularly for 5 years at U of H. I taught leadership. Then I taught Chinese oil executives from the Middle East. And I taught a course one time in Dubai at the Jebel Ali area of Dubai, almost up to Abu Dhabi. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East.
That's right.
And but I just love talking to the kids. And so I remember what you're talking about. It was an presentation. I'm on the board of visitors. The CEO of Apple, for instance, is on the board of visitors. It's a good board. And the dean said, I'm going to warn you, John likes to provoke people, not in a negative way, but and I was always provocative. I can remember teaching a course with, I won't name names or schools, but these were highfalutin kids, a girl and a boy, young man and young woman. And I think she was on the U.S. swimming team. And I'm in this class teaching, and it's sort of a theater type of background. And they kept talking. And so after class, I kind of went, and they came down, and I said, you're not really paying attention. I don't want you to come back. This is credit.
Wow.
So the dean called me, a great personal friend, Arthur Varga, who I traveled with Arthur in Israel many times. We drove over the Negev one time, all over the Negev, counting camels and everything else, in southern Israel. But Arthur called me and he said, I understand you've told students they can't come back. I said, yes, Arthur, I fired them. And his quote was, John, you can't fire a student. And Arthur, I just did. So the next class, here they come in early, We're really sorry, Professor McNabb, and this. They turned out to be great students in the class, but took a different approach. I was when they offered me a teaching position at U of H, I said I don't want any money, and we're a state school. You have to have a salary. And so I think they paid me $6,500 a year. And Darlene and I, my bride forever, Darlene and I had been giving them multiples of $6,000 every year. So I thought it worked out okay. And I think they're very pleased with it. And I'm still very close at the University of Houston, still very close to Renu Couture, who's the president, great friend of mine, and Eloise, I can't remember Eloise's last name. Great, Bryce, I think. She's an executive vice president. Great friends still. So I've always, education was so important to me, Carter.
Right.
Because we really didn't have much. And I was so blessed to have a football scholarship. And then when I called Duke to say I didn't have a job, is there anything to do there? And they said, yeah, we'll hire you. And they hired me. And the GI Bill and my paid position at Duke paid for my MBA. It's very, very special. So when people would ask me to go to Dartmouth and make a talk, or go to Chicago, or go to Rice, I've spoken at a lot of colleges around the country. And when they'd ask me, I'd always say yes if I could. Just try to give,
Which is terrific. Now, you mentioned the Mideast, and sometime back, you and I were talking, and I can't remember what triggered it, but you mentioned the tragedy of Libya, and I'd like you to share that with our viewers, because no one understands the Mideast mind that I know as well as you, and the tragedy that I'm going to say Hillary Clinton inflicted upon the nation of Israel, Libya.
It just it's what goes on in Washington these days. You know, just think about Joe Biden. I mean, we've got people in Western North Carolina still living in tents. Okay, they're living in tents.
Yeah.
The ones that are still living.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of trouble getting federal aid there. Joe Biden just gave $1 billion to upgrade the Amazon.
Yes.
Come on. I mean, and that's in the spirit of uh, global change, global warming, global change, whatever. And I'm thinking, what about Western North Carolina?
Right.
Uh, Homelessness is up 81% during Joe Biden's time in office.
Horrifying.
I saw a video of Jill Biden, Dr. Jilly, who has an EED degree. She doesn't, she's not a medical doctor. And if I wanted an EED, education doctorate, I could get one online. And I'm not going to downplay that degree, but it's not something that's really hard to get.
No.
But her moniker is Dr. Jill Biden. It's great.
Yeah.
Fine. But
Dr.
I
Jill.
heard into the table in a video. It looked like she was running the cabinet. And I didn't vote for Jill Biden to run the country.
That's right.
And it's really sad now. You go back to what's going on in Washington, there's an incredible leadership void, in Washington. And I think about a good friend of mine whose son was an Apache helicopter pilot who actually died of heart cancer. And I can remember going over to Arlington. I have a lot of friends buried in Arlington.
Right.
And I remember going over to the little chapel there and then following the caisson up with his, coffin, flag draped coffin up to the burial ground. And I was with a lot of Pentagon people at that time. But I can also remember, and that was before the Biden, Obama, era started. But I can remember talking to somebody that said, these young people in the White House are just talking down to these generals and senior people in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's a mess right now as a result of Biden and Obama, a mess. And so I'm in a meeting in Washington, D.C., dinner meeting, not going to mention who or where or why, except it was in D.C., and General Milley was the featured speaker. And he gets up and he's got all his vegetable garden on. He's got all the ribbons. And I have a few ribbons too, but I earned them all.
Yeah, exactly.
Got the Distinguished Flying Cross, a bunch of air medals, that kind of thing. So, but anyway, General Milley gets up and he's real gruff. He's not very tall, pretty portly. And he's kind of barking as he talks. But the first thing out of his mouth was, he said, he's most proud of the inclusiveness of the military. And that's exactly what he said. Now, it might have been, inclusiveness was the exact word. It might have been 2 or 3 other different words. That was what he's most proud of in his time, running the military. And it blew me away. And if I had not been with this group, I would have just got up and walked out. But I couldn't. That would have been a statement. Right. I could not do that. But that's what's going on right now. And forget combat readiness. Forget about protecting American citizens. And if you think about when I was in Vietnam, we always knew they were going to come for us. We always knew that the American government, the military, would come for us. And my last student before I left the military was a guy named Hamilton, ICEL Hamilton, Gene Hamilton.
Right.
If anybody saw the movie Bat 21, we came for him. He got shot down by a missile. My last student, I remember going to church and hearing on the radio that a spy plane was shot down on the DMZ. That was him. And it's a wonderful story. Gene Hackman played Colonel Hamilton. Danny Glover was a FAC on the air. He was a forward air controller. It was really a great little movie. I don't know that it won any awards, but they always knew they were coming. And we still have people under Hamas in the Hamas prison someplace, some tunnel, some dang place. We
Yep.
still have people that are there that we didn't come for, and
We have
that's
not come for.
Biden and Obama. So Libya, I had a business in Tripoli, the capital, also
Right.
had in Benghazi, and since what Hillary Clinton did and what Obama did, they really didn't like what was going on in Libya. And I knew I'm trying to think of his name, Chris Stevens, I think is Ambassador Stevens.
Yes,
Who was killed.
you're right.
Yeah. So I knew and met, when I go to a foreign country, when I was running Wilbros, you sort of had to present your credentials, in Germany or Norway or in Libya. So I met the former prime minister. Stevens was out of the country because it wasn't a formal embassy. It was sort of called an embassy station, and that was
Right.
in Benghazi, and he was there. And then what came up was it was a spontaneous event by some terrorists or something that got on a video and got everybody riled up. Well, what in fact happened was Stevens was there with 4 secret CIA people. And that was it. They were guarding Stevens in this embassy adjunct or whatever. And so the spontaneous event were truck-mounted anti-aircraft, RPGs, well-armed terrorists. And this was a concerted attack on that embassy in Benghazi.
Right.
And I was aware of Aviano Air Base because of it. I can't mention a lot about this, but I knew a lot about Aviano Air Base in southern Italy because I had a mission, a Middle East mission at one time that would have been in the event of a nuclear war, just put it that way.
All right.
And Aviano is sort of north and a little bit east of Benghazi in Libya, across the Mediterranean. A C-130 can do airspeed, and C-130 is a transport plane that could have carried troops and military equipment, weapons. C-130 would take about 45 minutes to an hour to get across from Aviano to Benghazi.
Right.
And that C-130 could have landed in the desert, hardened desert. But there are airstrips, in Libya, of course. And they never were called. So those guys fought for 13 hours.
13 hours. And they could have gotten rescue there within an hour.
Yeah. And so I don't know what was going on with Obama and Hillary. Who knows who knows who's running the country right now? I don't think Biden. So who knows these things? But what I do know is they could have had support and help land right there in Benghazi. And so I met one of the widows of one of those soldiers, those CIA agents, and met their little son in DC one time and had a nice talk with her about that.
Left him to die. Yeah.
A huge mistake on the part of the Obama, Biden, and Hillary Clinton administration. Those young guys didn't have to die, and Ambassador Stevens didn't have to die either.
And it goes straight back to what you were saying of when you were in Vietnam, you had the confidence they'd always come for you.
They always come for you.
No one came for those soldiers. We're almost out of time, and I want to touch on, before we finish up here, Trump personally. You were the co-chair of the Trump Leadership Council, okay?
Sure
which
was.
helped him formulate his business policy. I think you and Harold Hamm were the chairman. Rolling Stone article said with Ham seated to Trump's right and McNabb to his left in the first meeting.
Yeah.
That's from the Rolling Stone article. I don't even know if you remember that article, but
I'll tell you the funny thing about it. That Rolling Stone article, I mean, can you imagine me being featured in Rolling Stone magazine?
there you go.
Stone magazine was designed as a hit piece that missed.
Yeah.
It's a
Oh,
very,
yeah.
very positive article.
Yeah. It was a very positive article. And give us your impression of Donald Trump. What is your impression? I mean, it is so all over the board because of media distortions. I believe you know him personally. You've been there with him, sitting by his side. What's your impression of him as a person and as a leader?
Well, first of all, I hate to start with anything because there's a lot of other things as well, but he's very sharp. He's a great listener. He didn't grow up filthy rich. His father was in the Horatio Alger Association with me. Now, of course, he's been passed away a good while, but
Right.
not with me, but before. Donald Trump is well educated. He's a good businessman. And what I mean by that is he's tough as hell. He's a tough. And, I mean, people would say, well, he's this and that, and he didn't do this or didn't do that. He's just a business guy. He's tough. And to run a big business, and I had businesses all over the world, it really isn't easy. And so smart, tough, great listener. And he takes an approach to the government that's not political. He takes a business approach to the presidency. And poor Joe Biden. I mean, I hate to call it sad because I can remember being in the Senate office building 8 years ago. And I can remember no names. I can remember being with 3 senators, no names, no parties. And the subject of Joe Biden came up and there was subdued laughter. Good old, and they just were chuckling. So, and if you look at Biden's background, I mean, he thought he went to Delaware State, but he went to Delaware, said he played football. I had one of my teammates play football at Delaware, and I see my teammates' name in the past in rosters. I don't see Joe Biden's. And then Joe Biden goes to Syracuse. At that time, Syracuse was one of the lowest rated law schools in the United States. Joe Biden said he was an honor student. And there were like 105 students, graduating students in his class. And I believe we can check this. I believe he finished 96th out of 105. Now, and I know we're about the same age. I don't know why Joe Biden wasn't serving with me in Vietnam.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, I don't know that. And by the way, I don't care.
Yeah.
Way too long, way too late to worry about that stuff. But there's so many things about this current administration that is so foreign to me in so many ways. It's just hard. It's hard for me to understand it.
It's hard to understand. And it's like, we thank God we survived. I'm just going to be honest with you. We thank God we survived. And in closing, you'll soon be married, you and Darlene, 26 years, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yep. February 20th, you'll be married 26 years, yep. Which is, so in your book, I told people there's a lot of personal advice. There's a lot of advice in how you can live well, live successfully, and become a good and decent person. And I'm going to close with this quote and ask you to briefly comment on it. There are many factors, just from your book, many factors that contribute to defining a person. Their conscious and subconscious thoughts, talents, preparation, care, and luck. Your life is a product of your circumstances, but it's also a product of your choices, your will, and your values. If you're intentional about your thoughts and goals, they can be realized. The choice is yours.
Right. Your life ends up as your choices. Now, environmental plays a difference in that. It plays a role. So if you had solid parents who were great parents and great teachers, growing up isn't easy, irrespective. It's just hard. But if you had that, that's a start. But also, a person can have a lot of say in their own lives through what they learn and lead and love. Lead, learn, love. So reading is so important, and I continue to read. Um, I don't know anybody that reads more than Harold Hamm,
Really?
and Harold has a high school degree, and he bought his company for 27 billion about 2 years ago. He bought it, took it private.
Unbelievable.
Both of Harold's boards. I'm actually have been on two other university related boards with him. We're very close friends. We don't talk a lot. He's busy and I'm busy, but we're both doing different things. Obviously, I think he got real involved with the Trump campaign this time. I didn't. I'm done with
Right.
that. But
Right.
people have the ability to make a difference in their own lives. And once you've made a difference in your own life and the lives around you, family, friends, parents, whatever, then you can make a difference in a lot of different ways. And in fact, the definition of leadership is simply making a difference. And I would also add making a difference ethically and morally. And so that's why I'm trying to live my life that way, my
And you're
friend.
doing it. And you're doing it. And we thank you for sharing this part of your life with us. It's been absolutely informative. It's been delightful. So, John McNabb, thank you very, very much for joining.
Carter, thanks for having me on. It's been fun kind of looking back.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And folks, thank you for joining us. Get out there, fight the good fight, and follow this gentleman's example. Thank you. Let's do this.